Hello. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada struck down the country's ban on assisted suicide as unconstitutional. It rejected fears that the ruling would introduce a slippery slope into killing the vulnerable as being based on anecdotal examples. The following year, the Canadian Parliament legalised euthanasia for those who suffer from a terminal illness whose natural death was reasonably foreseeable. 7 years on, Canadian police are investigating the assisted suicide of a 61-year-old woman after her daughter said she was not able to provide consent due to her mental health. One woman was killed because she couldn't find affordable housing to suit her medical needs. Others because it was cheaper than getting the treatment they needed. To talk about the slippery slope that Canada is on is Associate Professor in American History at the University of Sunderland and someone with deep knowledge of euthanasia and assisted suicide, Dr. Kevin Yuill. Dr. Yuill, thank you very much indeed for joining me. If we can get one thing out in the open straight away, it is the fact that we're the Christian Institute, but you're an atheist and very open about that, aren't you? I just think it's important to let people know that from the start, that you're not coming from a religious perspective. Well, in the introduction there, I talked about Canada's slippery slope, but it does seem, in terms of the speed that things have happened, to be more like a precipice. How did we get here?
Well, I mean, I always argue that it is a moral precipice. Legalizing any form of assisted suicide or euthanasia is a moral precipice, because once you do that, then you open up a potential demand for other groups to be involved. So if you legalize it for terminal illness, which is what was justified in Canada in the very first place. It was regarding a terminally ill woman in British Columbia who wanted an assisted death. And it was legalized basically by the Supreme Court, ordering the government to amend the legislation in existence. And what you can see is that they opened up the floodgates to that. And I think this is the case in every country where it's been legalized for a reasonable period of time. So you can see that it was also legalized in the Netherlands on the same basis of somebody with a terminal illness. And yet it is now given to, for instance, autistic people, 8 autistic people in a particular period between 2015 and 2018, I believe, were euthanized. And it's being brought in as a sort of something that cleans up after inconvenient people. And I think that is the major concern. But it begins, of course, with justifying the idea that death is medical treatment. And that's something that I oppose.
Cleans up after inconvenient people. That's very strong language.
Yes, it is. And I think I never want to be unfair to the people who are actually accomplishing these deaths, nor to those who are campaigning, because I think many of them, if not almost all of them, are very honest in what they want to do, which is to provide compassion for people who are in a very invidious situation. But I do think when you look at the last couple of cases, people who find their own existence is inconvenient and people who fit into categories that society finds are inconvenient are increasingly going towards medical assistance and dying, as it's called in Canada, or MAID, because of the situations that they're in. And the last 2 cases, which I wrote about last week, were really about grinding poverty more than anything else. And yes, that's strong language, but we are seeing people killed. And I think it's, how can you object to strong language about that and not the people being killed in the first place?
Quite right. Well, you've just mentioned the fact that you were writing about this last week, and I mentioned a couple of the examples that you were talking about. How common are the kind of cases that you're writing about in Spiked?
I believe they're very exceptional. I mean, we're talking about a total of 6,000 odd deaths. We're talking about a few.
But I guess assisted suicide began as something that was supposed to be exceptional in the first place.
Well, precisely. And I think what we've seen is an expansion of it, and much more worryingly is an expansion of the law in Canada. So in the past, you used to have, the phrase was reasonably foreseeable. You had to have a reasonably foreseeable death. Whereas now you're allowing many more people to be involved, to request a euthanasia from their doctor because Bill C7, which came into effect in March, was extended it to various different people. And from March next year, I believe, it will be even those suffering from nothing more than a mental illness. And in fact, that will increase the numbers of people who are outside of the generally accepted areas where, for instance, somebody's dying of a terminal disease, usually cancer or some sort of heart disease or multiple sclerosis, any of these terrible diseases. And they're opening it up to people who are suffering nothing more than a disability and who manage to convince the doctor that this is the right thing to do. When they open up the floodgates to mental illness next year, I think you'll see many more people. These people tend to be at the very bottom of society, disabled people who are prevented from working. They're given terrible, very little money in Canada. And those two very tragic cases, I think, even though they don't represent a majority of people, are very, very worrying.
We should talk about economics in this. Is the cost of care versus the cost of killing starting to come into this debate?
Well, I think it's shocking that it's come into it at all. And that's why I pointed to these two cases in the article that I wrote last week. And I think what is going to increasingly happen is that people are internalizing the worthlessness with which society actually regards them. And I think that's the real problem. I don't think we're going to see a sort of Nazi kind of, we're taking you and you and you and putting you out of your misery. But I think what's happening and is going to happen increasingly in the future is that people are internalizing the fact that they're being told that their lives are worthless enough, that they are being given advice that they might be able to end their lives, rather than suicide prevention, which is provided for the majority of the population. So I think, though these examples are small at the minute, I think this is a very significant thing. And it is something that historically has never entirely dropped out of the whole discussion. And I think since the very first suggestions for modern euthanasia programs in 1870, you can see that there are two elements that are compassion, which people say, what is the point of this suffering at the end of death? I think that is an important motivation, but also rationality or utilitarianism, if you like. What is the point of this person in this situation living? And it has always been asked, is this person useful to society? And I think you're going to find many more people who are living at the edge, at the margins of life, and who are disabled or who are suffering various different problems. And they are the ones who are being told, do you know what? Euthanasia is a possibility for you. And many more of them are internalizing that. I see this on Twitter all the time, where they're saying, what's the point of me? I can't do the world any good. I might as well go for MAID. And in fact, many people, unfortunately, are doing that right as we speak.
But the argument would be made, of course, is, well, we're just here to facilitate their autonomy. No one's forcing them to make that decision. But from what you're saying, it seems to suggest that there is just a pressure internally and externally on people, which perhaps calls the level of autonomy people have into question.
Yes, well, first of all, I don't believe the autonomy argument at all, because if you're going to provide autonomy, you help every suicide. You can't just decide, you can't say, actually, your suicide is not something I would support, and I will support yours. The minute you do that, you get rid of the autonomy argument. It doesn't really work unless you think that it's legitimate to provide autonomy only to some people and not to others. Then we don't have any conception of equality. In fact, this is the basis of many disabled groups' problems with legalized assisted dying, is that they are always put in this group where, yes, we'll help to give you a push off the precipice. Other people will do everything we can to save you from suicide. So I think the autonomy thing doesn't really work with this entire discussion. And if you call people at the margins of life useless, and you say that they are a drag on society, and you imply that, many will internalize that, and many will be opting for MAID simply because they feel that their lives are not worthwhile and that they might as well die. And that's, I think, is a really problematic aspect. And it's something that is almost inevitable as soon as you do the first legalization of assisted suicide anywhere. Then you pass that precipice where you say there is a group of people who are useless and a group of people who we will strenuously try and prevent their suicides. And that is uneven and, to me, unacceptable.
Well, let's talk about this precipice and bring it back to the UK experience, because at present in the UK, assisted suicide is not legal, but Baroness Meacher has legislation under consideration at Westminster. Liam MacArthur has got a bill under consideration at Holyrood. And no doubt there would be those who would say, well, Canada is Canada, and even if what you say is true there, that won't be the experience here. But what are the lessons that legislators here should learn from the Canadian experience?
Well, I think, first of all, what we can see is that in every country where assisted dying has been legalized for any amount of time, it is increased and expanded its categories of people who are eligible for euthanasia and or assisted suicide. Once it's legal inside a country, there are no real barriers to it expanding. And in fact, logically, it makes sense, because if you say we are doing this to prevent suffering, then how can you turn around and say to somebody who has 7 months to live, you're not suffering, and then your suffering, a person who has 5 months to live, is validated? It doesn't make any sense. Doctors will tell you that it's impossible to make an exact prognosis at that stage. And in fact, it just ends up expanding, because how can you turn down, if you define death as medical treatment, how can you turn down people from getting the medical treatment that they want and that they need?
And why should age be a barrier? Why should condition be a barrier? These things ought not to be barriers.
Well, precisely, and this is what we've seen in both Netherlands and Belgium, where children can get a euthanasia, and this is being discussed right now in Canada. If anybody thinks that this isn't going to happen in Britain, they are fooling themselves.
Dr. Kevin Yuill, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.